they encountered two new ideas. One is the introduction of a soul that continues on after life, because again, in the Bible, there is no such concept of a soul. And the second is that resurrection, that ultimately everybody will be resurrected, bodily resurrection. Those two ideas came into Jewish thought from their experience with the Zoroastrians in Persia. All right? That is not biblical thinking. That is rabbinic thinking. At the same time, I just want to remind you as a general rule, I remember my first Rabbi Simon Potok saying we are not biblical Jews. We don't live as biblical Jews. We live as rabbinic Jews, meaning what the Bible says is what the rabbis interpret it to say. You have a line in the Bible that repeats over and over, Lo tivashel gedi b'chalev imo, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Well, we know what that literally means, but it has nothing to do with the rabbinic idea that you don't mix milk and meat. That is clearly an interpretation. It's not the literal sense of the words. So we live by the rabbinic understanding of the Bible, not the Bible itself. Or we'd be walking around with stones, as the Year of Living Biblically does, where we walk around with stones and throw them at people we think are having affairs. All right? All right?
And it's basically the Jewish owners of plates and dishes.
That's right. All right. So in rabbinic times, it is clear that religious thought and behavior were interrelated. And so as new ideas came into the world, new practices came with them. In Maccabees number 1, we read of Simon's reburying of Jonathan's bones in their ancestral home of Modin. And so that is reading number 14. And so I'm just going to ask for volunteers, but you do need to stand up at the stand so people can hear you. So Joyce, since you were there, I'm going to ask you to read number 14. You win, but you need to go to the stand. That'll teach you.
Reading 14.
Yes.
Okay. All Israel bewailed him with great lamentation and mourned him many days. And Simon built a monument over the tomb of his father and his brothers. He made it high, with polished stone at the front and back. He also erected 7 pyramids, erecting about them great columns, and on the columns he put suits of armor for a permanent memorial, and he carved ships so that they would be seen by all who sail the sea.
All right, so there's at the very end here, there's a metaphorical use of the word ships, which is reflecting the rabbinic new idea that the soul has this post-life voyage. All right, again, that would not be biblical. And there's a reflection of human existence as prolonged beyond the immediate moment of death, and it's evident in the reburying of the bones, and we'll talk a lot about that as we go forward. Death came to be understood as a staged experience, one which extended over a period of time and then culminated in the reburying of the bones once the flesh had deteriorated. It made sense for them in the ancient world to treat the bones with a sense of respect. You look at flesh and you look at it deteriorating, and it's not how we want to think of ourselves. Bones stay. And so bones came to represent that sense of eternity, and so that's what they buried. The putrefaction of the flesh is revolting in many ways, and we don't want to deal with that, but the bones are permanent, and that was an important piece. I do want to also mention that one of the things you'll notice, in the ancient world, they were involved in the moment of death. We tend to make it nice and clean. People go to the hospital, you don't have children anywhere, you don't want kids at funerals, etc. That is not a Jewish way of thinking, plain and simply. Children should be exposed to it. It is a part of life. It is part of the life experience. All right? And the result is oftentimes what happens as we try to clean it up a bit. What you have is people who are anticipating death, not talking about it because they don't want to hurt the person who's dying, and the person who's dying experiencing a very lonely moment in their lives because no one will talk to them about it. We'll talk about every other life experience, bar mitzvahs, weddings, etc. But this seems to be one we won't talk about. Everybody's trying to protect everybody else, and meanwhile you lose what is a moment of life. Dying. Not death, but dying. Dying is an experience of life. Yes, sir. Yeah, we're talking about sometime between, so the Maccabees are in the late 2nd century before the Common Era. And it's continuing through, what we're doing is through Talmudic times, which is essentially the 6th century of the Common Era. So it's about an 800-year period. Okay? So this is Pharisaic. We're talking about the Pharisees, and it's later confirmed by the early rabbis in the tractate of Pirkei Avot that there's an afterlife. This is now in Pirkei Avot. We read, reading number 15. If there's a volunteer, just please step to the stand. And when we get to 16, do I have a volunteer? All right, Sandy, Leslie. All right. 15.
He would say, those that are born will die, and those that are dead will live again, and the living will be judged. Against your will you were created, and against your will you were born. And against your will live, and against your will you die, and against your will you are destined to give account and reckoning before the King of Kings, the Holy One. Blessed be he.
All right. There's no doubt here. There's an afterlife by the time we get to Pirkei Avot. There's no question. Pirkei Avot is Mishnaic, meaning it was finalized by the year 200. Okay? But such beliefs, this is rabbinic, this is Pharisaic. Not everyone agreed, and it didn't go unchallenged. So 16, Leslie, if you would, Arthur Marmerstein notes.
It is probable that the Sadducees were the successors of an older school opposing the doctrine of a future life as a part of the reform of the old religion in Israel. We know that the Sadducees were within the conservative party in Israel, and to abandon a belief held by former generations would contradict the traditions of this party.
Right. So what this is saying essentially is the Sadducees were saying, what's with this newfangled Judaism stuff? This afterlife stuff? That's not traditional. That's not the way we understand Judaism. What are you introducing into Judaism? Right? It's, you know, whatever the newfangled thing of today would be, that's the equivalent. How dare you? Right? And Josephus tells us indeed that that is what they were thinking. In reading 17, I'll do this one. The doctrine of the Sadducees is this: the souls die with the bodies. They denied not merely a belief in revival after death, but also the doctrine of a future life, that once you're dead, you're dead. So that was the Sadducean belief, because that was the traditional belief. Nevertheless, the rabbis were not accepting what the Sadducees had to offer, and they called for an understanding of life after death and judgment with it. You read that, we heard that in Pirkei Avot in our reading there. All right, so reading number 18, I'll do 18, we'll go on. Akavia ben Mihalel said, consider three things and you will not come to sin. Know from where you have come and to where you are heading, and before whom you will give justification and accounting. From where have you come? From a putrid drop. To where are you heading? To a place of dirt, worms, and maggots. And before whom will you give justification and accounting? Before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he. You cannot give accounting if you don't believe that there's an afterlife, plain and simply. Okay? So we've introduced two concepts. One is a soul that continues on after life, and two is resurrection of the body at some point. Those two concepts have now entered into Judaism, and although they both exist in early rabbinic times, let's say after the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, they don't have equal emphasis. To the contrary, resurrection was the greater of the two. They weren't worried about the soul after life initially. Why? Because they were living in a time of terrible pain, and they believed that the Messiah was coming. So their emphasis was on resurrection that would come with the Messiah. In a classic text, I'm telling you about the book, unless you really want to sit for hours and hours with each page. It's not necessarily the book to grab, but I want you to know of its existence, because this is the classical text on liturgy, but it is highly technical. It's not a book I've ever sat and read cover to cover. Okay, I've researched through it. In this book, L. Bogan suggests that the inclusion of the belief in the afterlife as it's expressed in the Amidah, if you were in my prayer class, you may remember this, was a deliberate institution of the Pharisees because the Sadducees were saying it's not true. And so the Pharisees and the rabbis said, we're going to stick it to you and force everybody to say these words every time they pray. And it shows up 5 times in the one paragraph. So if you look at reading 19a, 19b, and 19c, I've given you 3 translations. I'm going to start with the one that's most accurate. This is Michalkel Chayim Bechesed. We sing it. It's lovely. All right? It's about God's power, and the ultimate manifestation of God's power is the ability to conquer death. That we will be resurrected because death will die. All right? So I'm going to read the one from Art Scroll. It's the most accurate to the text and most in terms of translation. That's number C. You are eternally mighty, my Lord. The resuscitator of the dead are you, abundantly able to save, who sustains the living with kindness, resuscitates the dead with abundant mercy, supports the fallen, heals the sick, releases the confined, and maintains his faith with those who sleep in the dust. Remember, so now God has a relationship with those who are dead. Who is like you, O Master of mighty deeds, and who is comparable to you, O King, who causes death and restores life, and makes salvation sprout? You are faithful to resuscitate the dead. Blessed are you, God, who resuscitates the dead. Resuscitates Mechaye, who gives life to. All right? And I just want to read that with you, the one that's from Arsim Shalom, so you have a sense of as well of what it's saying. You'll see it's been flowered up a little bit so that it's less confrontational. Your might, Adonai, is boundless. You give life to the dead. Great is your saving power. Your love sustains the living. Your great mercies give life to the dead. You support the falling, heal the ailing, free the fettered. You keep your faith with those who sleep in the dust. Whose power can compare to yours? You are the master of life and death and deliverance. That's not what it says. Okay? Faithful are you in giving life to the dead. Praise are you, Adonai, master of life and death. It's not master of life and death. It's who gives life to the dead. What it's saying, but they're taking some of the power out of it so that it doesn't seem as controversial. All right, and any questions? So every time you're seeing Mechalkel Chayim Bechesed, you're going to see that we're talking about raising the dead. In the Reform movement, they've gotten rid of it. It doesn't say Mechaye HaMeitim, it says Mechaye HaKol, who gives life to everything, because they don't like the theology. Now, in the new one, right, for years it wasn't even there. Now they put it in parentheses. That's correct. Yes, ma'am. 1, 2. Joyce, and I'll repeat the question. So the question is, how is it they can make changes that just seem to be and make it nicer and change the theology? The reality is a lot of the ancient theology, in many ways, we've already rejected. So I just had a thought and it died of loneliness. Yes, God. We've changed numbers of things in the theology of the ancient world because it no longer makes sense to us. If you look at, there's a prayer on Friday evening that we say, and it talks about the rolling of the sun, and it's talking about they used to believe there was a dome over the earth, and at night the sun would go outside the dome, roll across the top where you couldn't see it, and come back in the morning. Now, science has forced us to question that. Okay? At least question it. All right? And, right. And so, right, rolling away the darkness before the light and light before the darkness. That's exactly it. Golel mipnei choshek vechoshek mipnei or. That's exactly what it says, okay? And so time also causes us to look at things differently. And right, is it right or wrong? There are things you may not be comfortable with in the theology. You have on the high. We just finished the Amidah for the holidays. And it says basically, you have been chosen. You've been raised above all the other languages, meaning the other peoples. Are you comfortable with that? Right. So there is theology, but there's theology that struggles. It's not, the change is not new. Yeah. So the question is Mechayei Amitim, is resurrection metaphorical? That's what you're suggesting, right? So let me tell you about a wonderful debate I saw. So Neil Gaiman wrote a book called The Death of Death, in which he describes resurrection and says, I buy this. Like, plain and simply, why would God be so limited as to not be able to do that? He is the head of the theology department at Jewish Theological Seminary. The head of the theology department at the University of Judaism is Elliot Dorff. The two of them had this wonderful debate because Elliot Dorff said that's just nonsense. So you're in good company of theologians who struggle with the concept. That's my point. All right? It can be metaphorical, but it also doesn't have to be. It certainly wasn't metaphorical in its time. When they were talking about it in the first century, it wasn't intended to be metaphorical. Whether or not we now take it that way is a second question. Okay? All right. So this resurrection was the dominant of the two ideas. But what happened is with the destruction of the Bar Kokhba revolution, which happened in 135, when it failed, they began to realize the messianic times are not on the horizon. And so there was a shift in the dominance. The new focus was life after death. We'll worry about resurrection at the end. But right now, let's worry about what will be now. And so you ended up with a shift in focus from resurrection to the continuation of the soul in some world until that day. All right, does that make sense? Okay. Shift a little bit. The Mishnah now divides the events surrounding death into 7 phases. Most of these you'll know. First is dying itself. The second is the interval between death and when you do the burial. We all know that period. The next is the burial, the funeral itself, step 3. Step 4 is the Shiva, the week that follows. Step 5 is the Shaloshim, the balance of the month after that. Step 6, and according to the Mishnah, is a passage of up to a year. And step 7 in the Mishnah is the reburial of the bones. Now that we're not quite as familiar with. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that. A side note, we all know that Judaism is a life-affirming religion. We prioritize life. Here's how the rabbis played that out, just so you should know this. If a funeral procession and a wedding procession were to meet in the streets, the mourners must turn aside because the bride takes precedence. Life takes precedence. If you have to choose between doing a condolence call and attending the birth of a child, you go to the birth of a child. You don't do the condolence call because life takes precedence. That's the application of a value. It seems somewhat contrary to what many of us would do, but if you take this concept that we are a life-affirming religion, that's what it means. Side note. All right. From where I'm going now is a little bit different. This is a course I took recently, and they made me read, and I'm glad they did, a book by David Kramer. David Kramer is a professor of rabbinics and Talmud at JTS. It's called The Meanings of Death in Rabbinic Judaism. It's a fascinating read. It's not terribly difficult, but it'll challenge you. So I'm going to give you the highlights from it. Behaviors have both pragmatic and spiritual underpinnings to them that apply to both the mourner and the deceased. And so there's a duality of meaning in the Mishnaic text. And what does that mean? Let me give you a couple examples. I think I have 5. An example. The custom is when somebody dies, you take the body and you move it to the floor. Okay, you move it to the floor. All right, on the most pragmatic level, in warm cultures, the body begins to deteriorate very quickly, so you put it on the floor where it's cooler. Okay, it was very pragmatic. Okay, you moved it to the floor. Simultaneously, it also has a meaning of the practice, the belief that upon death, the soul remains present and experiences discomfort and therefore needs attention, and the floor was, for whatever reason, must have been considered more comfortable than whatever they were lying on at the time. Proximity to the soil conveyed respect and provided comfort to the soul as the body began its return to dust. Right? That's one. And now it gets even more complicated. 2, you know from Chevra Kadisha? Chevra Kadisha is the committee that prepares the body for death. They ritually bathe the body. 3 reasons. Again, 2 pragmatic and 1 a lot less so. 1, it's in response to the Torah's description that the body at death becomes tameh. Tameh means impure, but when you become tameh, and there are moments in life we become tameh, it means that you're not qualified to engage in ritual experiences. All right? You need to wash you can't approach God in that state. That's what it means to be impure. You're not clean enough in some way to approach God. So that's number 1. The second is, sociologically, the washing of the body and the anointing of the body, they used oils, was a widespread custom in the ancient world. Why? Why the oils? Because the body smelled. Right? So one of the ways you dealt with that is to apply oils. That's why people wore perfumes. They weren't bathing like we do. Perfumes were very common. All right? But there's a third reason, and this is where it gets a little bit different. We also see here the needs of the deceased, all right, being addressed. According to the rabbis, the use of these oils was intended to assist with the stiffness experienced by the deceased, that they were still sentient. That's very different. That the deceased is still in some way sentient, therefore is experiencing stiffness at death, and they oil the body to relieve some of that for the dead. This is Mishnaic thought, okay? I've got lots more on that one, because I really believe that. The location of the burial also had a parallel. So, for example, according to the Mishnah, the caves for burial, because they buried people in caves, needed to be at least 50 cubits or 75 feet outside of the city limits in what the Mishnah called grave neighborhoods, cemeteries, but caves that were essentially that. By including this law is included in a series of laws about factories like tanneries. And so the first thing you would assume, if that's the case, is it's about bad smells. Okay, so the first reason is odor. Keep them away. Spiritually, we also might conclude that they're tameh, they're impure, and you want to establish a boundary between that which is tameh and that which is able to approach God. So you've got smells, pragmatically, you've got the status of tameh, but once again, if you assume that the soul remains sentient after death, people were afraid of those souls, and that was an attempt to create distance at that moment. Okay? Got more? Following the burial, this 2-tiered approach continues. The early rabbis ruled that the couches must be overturned. You turn the couch over, creating discomfort for the mourner. Today we sit on low stools. We're supposed to be uncomfortable, okay? We sit on low stools, but they turn it over, symbolizing the disruption of normal life. It should be different from how you normally live. Okay? The same behavior also represents the lowly feeling experienced by the departed soul. And so the proximity to the ground, when you sit lower on the ground, creates a closeness between the mourner and the sentient deceased. Okay? This is rabbinic thinking. There are other social limitations that are also placed out there. These are some of the, I'm giving you some of the customs of mourning as well. Avoiding business concerns during the week of Shiva. Any sexual intimacy is prohibited. But they attend to the needs of the grief of the mourner. But they also create a partnership with the deceased who can no longer engage in those behaviors. It's a sensitivity to the sentient deceased. The mirrors is more about you shouldn't be concerned with what you look like at that point. All right, it's just you are who you are in that moment, and emotionally that's true. As someone who's done funerals with people for years, I get to know people as who they really are in those moments. When I'm sitting with them before the funeral and talking to them, it's when you really you let your hair down. You just are you, no pretense. Right. It was too emotional to do. Yeah, yeah. Because there are ways in which we're ready to return to life, and there are ways in which we're not after a week. And those symbolism is very powerful. Yes, Joyce. 1 week, the Shiva period. Right. Once you start to emerge and go out into society, you're expected to follow the rules of society. Okay, and that means making yourself look presentable. A final example of this dual level of thinking. They often, and I told you, they buried people in the caves. That was the tradition. They found in those caves, in some of the archaeological discoveries, is household goods in the excavated burial caves. They may have been meals, but it's unlikely. What it really was is they had a belief they were providing for the needs of the deceased. They were leaving food. Now, I'm sure it got eaten, but I don't think it was by the deceased. Okay? On a pragmatic level, I'm sure they had animals visiting and bugs and all that kind of stuff, and it got eaten, but I wouldn't bet on the deceased having a meal. All right. All of these, these practices and beliefs culminate after a year. Why after a year? What I described at the beginning, we remove ourselves from death. We step away from it. They were very aware, because burial was in the caves. After a year, the flesh is gone. They were aware of that because they were in contact with it. We don't, I don't know about you, I'm not digging up graves. I don't have any sense of this. They did. And so after a year, at that point, the mourner, since at that point that you're reburying the bones, the ascent of the soul to heaven, and the mourners begin to mirror that experience by a full return to life. You have this parallel that's going, that I don't know about you, I had no idea until I sat down and I read this book. This was all new to me, but it is rabbinic thinking. So to some extent, Joyce, you asked the question, how do we make changes? Are you ready to buy all that? Are you ready to make changes? Okay. You asked the perfect question. You set me up. Any questions or comments before I go on? Leslie. Funeral home? Mhm.
Nobody came up seeing how the grandchildren.
Right,
Of course, you have to be about the children of that
right.
and it so hurt my feelings that I made it a practice. Every funeral, go up to grandchildren. You don't know if they live near each other.
Right, you have to attend to the need. They're not mourners in the traditional sense, but that doesn't mean that they don't have emotional needs in that moment. This is about grandchildren for those of you online. The question is, what are the roles of grandchildren? On the other hand, grandchildren, yes, but oftentimes I'll hear, an adult grandchild, all right? And should I also sit Shiva? And I have a very clear response to that, as long as it doesn't interfere with your taking care of the real mourners. The children of the deceased have to be taken care of. You can sit Shiva provided their needs are taken care of first. Because I don't care how close you are to your grandparent, it's not the same thing as being a child. It is different. Okay? All right. New idea. New subject. As the soul departs, we are told that the mourner is obligated, and we all know this, to take care of the needs of the funeral. That's one of the things you do in those first couple of days. You're sufficiently numb. None of the reality has hit you, and you're sufficiently numb. And so you have a responsibility of an honor to the deceased to take care of the needs. The reason I say that is because of that responsibility, you are exempt from other ritual mitzvot. So during that time, you don't say Shema, you don't put on tefillin, you don't engage in prayer. You're exempt from those. The Jerusalem Talmud says, reading number 20, do we have a victim? Bevakasha, Eric.
He should eat with a friend, or if he has no friend with whom to eat, he should at least eat at another house, away from the deceased. Or if there is no other house, he should make a partition between himself and the deceased. Or if he has nothing with which to make a partition, he should at least turn away from the deceased. He should not recline comfortably when eating, nor should he eat or drink all that he might desire. He should not eat meat nor drink wine. He does not join in the communal blessing after meals. If he blesses, others do not answer, Amen. And if others bless, he does not answer, Amen.
Right. What you've got here, right. What you've got here is an isolation from the community. Right? That when you're in mourning, you can't engage in the ritual behaviors with the community. It doesn't mean they can't be there to support you, but ritually, you are isolated during those first couple days. And so, the intent is to echo the experience being had by the deceased. If you don't have social meals and you don't engage in collective prayer, that's the experience of the deceased in that moment. They no longer can do so. And so you're isolating yourself from the rituals because the deceased cannot do that. And you honor them by refraining from the joys that are inherent in those rituals. Similarly, there's a tradition of avoiding meat and wine, all right? And it was often associated with the mourning practices in the temple times, but it also parallels the loss of the pleasure of the deceased. To actually, at mourning, you're not supposed to eat meat. Life has been taken, okay? And you don't drink wine for obvious reasons. It's a source of joy, okay? The avoidance of meals at the burial sites. You certainly don't have a meal at the cemetery, okay? And that conveys the message, that's meant to convey the message that the deceased still have, even in the cemetery years later, have some sense of sentience and are therefore you're sticking it in their face that they can't eat. All right? It's unfair to do that. It's like sitting and having a hamburger on Yom Kippur in front of the congregation. Next year I'm going to do that and see how people react. Probably not well. There's some level that even contains beyond. Where do you get any ideas about the afterlife? Why not? Where does the soul go? Has it lost all connection to the body? Uh, what makes you say that? My point is, we don't know. Why is that any more ridiculous than the idea of a soul? Mm-hmm. Right. But why is the awareness of the soul in connection to the body any more ridiculous than the idea of a soul? Because it's not what we're accustomed to. That was my point. I said I was going to surprise you with some of this stuff. All right? It doesn't mean just like I haven't been there. I cannot tell you anything. I have no personal stories to share. I've not been dead yet. Yeah. Yep. We certainly do. Why do you visit a grave? On some level, it's metaphorical, and on some level, maybe not. Because we don't know. I don't know. I don't have an answer for you, but I can tell you it's no more ridiculous than the concept that we exist beyond life. If we exist beyond life, what makes any understanding of that more ridiculous? Right, that's why you wild. I have no idea. I don't know to be. That sounds probable, but I don't know.
So maybe they thought that the oils and stuff put on relaxed the body. I don't know.
Right. So I want to remind you, this is a world in which they believed that you could empower the sun by lighting candles at the winter solstice. Right? You have to understand, they understood that there was a cause and effect. They just didn't have the factors correctly. Okay? There is a different sense. But this is what we build our religion upon, is the thinking of the rabbis. So you can't just out and out reject it. You have to at least process it, and then kind of make sense of it on your own terms. But it's part of the data in our decision making and our thinking. Okay. The Jerusalem Talmud then goes on and addresses the period of Shiva. Within the Jerusalem Talmud, and again, not the Babylonian, this is the Jerusalem Talmud, the first 3 days of Shiva are distinguished as particularly intense. And by the way, that's why many people will do a 3-day Shiva instead of 7. 3 days, they considered it was more intense than the other 4. Okay? So the reality is it takes a few days for the reality of the death to set in. And so what they were saying, when people go away on vacation, they're not there. But after a while, you realize that, as much as you know it, now you really know it, they're not coming back. And so the idea was like 3 days, the loss sets in, and in parallel, the first 3 days are particularly challenging for the deceased. As is related in the text here, you have from Masechet Kedoshim in the Talmud. For all the 3 days, the soul hovers over the body, thinking that he or she will be able to return to it. When she sees the face of the body has changed, presumably the first strong evidence of decomposition, she gives up and leaves after 3 days. The belly splits, spewing its contents upon his face, and says to him, "Here is what you stole and took by force and put in me." At that moment, but his flesh will feel pain upon him, and his soul will mourn for him. This is rabbinics. Weird. I'm not necessarily buying it either, but you have to confront it. You can't say, I like this in the Talmud and I don't like this just because I don't. You have to confront it. As physical deterioration becomes evident, the true tradition basically understands that hope is removed from the deceased at that point, that they will be able to return. And it begins the very beginning of the journey beyond. Serves a double purpose then. So you've got the mourners going through this worst period of the time. At the same time, the soul is still kind of hanging on, hoping. And it's at the end of 3 days that there's sort of a beginning of a transition. This is that same dual purpose I've been speaking about. The Jerusalem Talmud offers reasons for Shiva. Here we go. It declares that in many ways, washing is a basic need, okay? So one of the things you're not allowed to do during Shiva is bathe, okay? But it makes a distinction. If just kind of washing yourself up for hygienic purposes is allowed, bathing is not. If you like a nice hot bath, no, okay? You're not supposed to find pleasure during this time. Washing yourself up so you don't smell is a different story. Okay? The prohibition of wearing shoes. You don't wear shoes. Again, leather and life. You don't wear shoes is also addressed. You are allowed to wear shoes if you're making a long journey. There was a sense of pain and putting somebody in danger that they couldn't run fast enough if they were attacked. Third prohibition, studying Torah. You're not allowed to study Torah during Shiva. And then they say, well, we're going to lift that one for those who have an excessive passion for learning. The final one, this one will make sense to you, and that is the limits on public behaviors during Shabbat. Okay, what do you do on Shabbat when you're sitting Shiva? You come to, right, you don't have a minyan at home, you come to shul. Declaring death to be the antithesis of creation, which is a theme of Shabbat. Shabbat takes precedence, and therefore the mourner is expected to join the community for the ritual services. However, when you go home, recognizing the pain, you're not only allowed, you're expected to sit Shiva. You join the community for tefillah, but you don't necessarily join for meals. You go home and you sit Shiva. It's only the ritual that you engage with the community on Shabbat. What a lot of this is doing on one level is it's prohibiting behaviors that connect us to the community, with the exception of Shabbat. We are stepping away from normal life. We avoid washing ourselves. That certainly will generally make you somewhat abhorrent to the community. You're not using a mirror. You're not washing yourself in the traditional sense. You're an outsider. You're declaring yourself physically an outsider. Torn clothing, lack of, the tradition is not that you take a ribbon. My mom passed away and I ripped my shirt. My basic feeling was, if it's not, this moment isn't worth the cost of a shirt, I think we can handle this, right? I ripped my shirt. Well, by doing that, you're also declaring yourself outside the bounds of normal society. None of us are walking around, and can I look around the room? I'm not seeing any torn shirts. That's not the norm, okay? All right, same thing with the lack of shoes. So on one level, the distancing seems to explain some of these practices, but not all of them. So for example, it doesn't explain the prohibition of sexual intimacy. There's no public behavior to that, please, okay? Torah study or engaging in work. You could sit in today's world, you could sit at home and do your work on your computer. It wouldn't be, if the reason is really about social isolation, those don't make sense. A better explanation, at least according to David Kramer and the rabbis, is that it is found in the second tier, the identification with the dead. Meaning, each of those behaviors which are prescribed are things the dead can no longer experience. And so you identify with them by doing these things. That's a more comprehensive explanation for the behaviors. Weird, yes? Not the way we'd normally think, but this is, I've read to you from the Talmud. I'm not making this up. Okay. It does make sense. Well, you've added a new midrash. You're relating to the dead who are so important to you. They would say you're relating to the dead because the dead are aware and you don't want to embarrass them. It's not that you're wrong, because we all engage in midrash. But that wasn't the logic behind for them, okay? As the dead in stages begins the journey to the world to come, so the mourner also slowly returns to societal connections. So subsequent to the 7 days of Shiva, the mourner enters this in-between stage during the 30 days of Shloshim, during which some of the prohibitions are removed and others are lightened. By the way, I don't know if you're aware, you only continue Kaddish for a parent more than 30 days. All other relationships, you stop saying Kaddish and your mourning is over after 30 days. Sibling, a spouse, a child. 30 days, you're done. For a parent, it's 11 months. The world will not come to an end if you, the concept was that you owe your parents more. Your child, it's a hierarchical relationship. With a child, they owed you, you don't owe them. Now, you're approaching it from the emotional standpoint, and I can't tell you you're wrong. I'm not suggesting you're wrong, but the rabbinic perspective was that it's about what you owe. It's a hierarchical relationship. Spouses are peers. Children owe you. Right? Siblings are peers. In the case of a parent, you owe them. There's not really a right and a wrong, but that's the rabbinic thinking. Another case of, gee, I don't know that I agree with that, and I might make a change in the theology, right? That's where you started, and as I said, you set me up, but it's really, that's reality. There are things in which you would look and say, I'm not holding on to that. If I need to say Kaddish for my spouse for 11 months, I'm going to do that. There's no prohibition, it just wasn't required. All right, everything I've said to you so far has to do with in the land of Israel, the Jerusalem Talmud. I have not yet dealt with outside the land and the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, because there it was different. Not 100% different, but different. In contrast, when you're living among a foreign culture, as they were in the 4th and 5th century, oftentimes Jewish customs stood in direct contrast to the surrounding culture. So for example, the Zoroastrians in Persia considered that the earth was holy, the dead body was not, and it's a sin to bury the body in the ground because you're making the ground unholy. Okay? That's Zoroastrian. So the Jews obviously had a problem because in direct contrast, Rabbinic Judaism considers non-burial dishonoring. Okay? It held such importance that, reading number 22, they didn't call it that, but I'll call it reading number 22 from Mishnah Brachot. One whose deceased relative is laid out unburied, this is before the burial, before him, and I'll get to why I underline that in a second, is exempt from the recitation of the Shema, from the Amidah prayer, and from the mitzvah to don tefillin, as well as all positive mitzvot in the Torah until the deceased has been buried. So obviously burial is very important. You're not allowed to do any of the rituals until. That is not Zoroastrian. It's the complete opposite. All right? Now, let me comment then on the before him that's underlined, and that you'll see in the next reading from Mishnah, from the Talmud. The first was from the Mishnah. The Talmud comments on the Mishnah. This is Talmud 18, Brachot 18. Rav Ashi says the phrase, the deceased is laid out before him, that's the one above, is not to be taken literally, but rather since it is incumbent upon him to bury the deceased, and he is not yet buried, it is as if he is laid out before him, as it states, and Abraham rose up before his dead, and when Abraham speaks with the Hittites, it is stated, so that I may bury my dead from before me. As long as it is incumbent upon him to bury him, it's as if he is laid out before him. And that's what gives you the permission not to do the other mitzvot. It's all right. Before him is not a place, it's a period of time. Okay? The basic idea, now this you're not going to like either, this is what the rabbi's basic feeling was, that decomposition was painful. And so you engaged in things that would prevent that kind of pain, even on the holiest of days. We know, no matter what the day is, if we're in pain and we're suffering, we're allowed to tend to those things. not necessarily a sore throat, but serious pain and suffering, okay? Well, if you believe that the deceased is experiencing the same thing, so is true there. You take care of their needs, oiling the body, the tahara, all the different kinds of things are still obligations during that period because it tends to the needs of the deceased. Taking it even a step further, reading 24. This is from Proverbs. A person should not walk in the cemetery with tefillin on his head and a Torah scroll on his arm and read therefrom. And if so, he transgresses the biblical text which says, he who mocks the poor affronts his maker. This is talking about that years later, they could be dead for 30 years. You don't walk across the cemetery because on some level they're with doing mitzvot, because on some level they're still aware that they can't do it and you're doing it, it's in your face. That's Proverbs. Right? A lot of things about Proverbs you wouldn't like. You wouldn't like the fact that you shouldn't talk to a woman because they have no sense. There's a lot of things in Proverbs that would not make you happy. Very interesting, the last chapter of Proverbs is Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor, and the rest of the book is degrading to women. It's a fascinating read. I'm not sure how it must have been appended at some point. It's all I can think of. It's a very degrading book. But nonetheless, this is what it says about the deceased. The Babylonian Talmud provides multiple examples, such as in Sukkot, the book of Masechet Sukkot, where it teaches that one engaged in the performance of one mitzvah is exempt from the performance of all other mitzvot. All right? So the primacy of preparing for burial extends to all stages of life. That's what Proverbs is saying. If you don't do those things in the presence of when they're not yet buried, if you would do it while they're already buried, all the more so that they haven't been buried yet. If you're going to avoid walking to a cemetery and engaging in ritual practices because the deceased, who might be 30 years buried, would be offended by your behavior, all the more so before the burial. They are even more aware. They haven't been buried yet. Are we sufficiently upset yet? Okay. All right, I'm going to switch topics. I'll take questions and then I'll switch topics. I want to go on to reincarnation. All right, the question is? So the question is, did the rabbis feel they were expressing their own views, or did they feel that they were divine? So, I'm going to answer this on two levels. Naturally, I'm a Jew. Since the Orthodox would answer the question that the Mishnah and Talmud were given at Sinai, okay, and were just later written down, there, in that mindset, it was divine. It's not a matter of rabbinic opinion. It was given at Sinai. It's the oral law. As a conservative Jew, I would say I place more historical context on things. And so therefore, I don't believe that the oral law was given at Sinai. I believe, as many in our movement, and Jacob Neusner is the ultimate on this, is that they wrote and they took Torah and they responded to it in terms of their own times. And what their rulings were reflected the times they were writing, in which they were writing, okay? And so I'd have to think that they knew they were expressing their opinions and superimposing divine intent upon it. So I hope that answers the question as unvaguely as I can possibly do. All right. Reincarnation, whereas resurrection is the return of the soul to the original body, reincarnation represents the soul's return to a new body. Is that less difficult to deal with? No, because actually reincarnation precedes resurrection. At some point in the future, it'll be reunited with the original body, but right now there's a step. Okay, Rabbi Lawrence Kushner describes being offered at past public lectures if he believes in resurrection. And he says the following, I love this. I'm puzzled. Of all the thousands and thousands of people who claim to have been resurrected, he says, not one has ever told anybody where he hid the money. All right, that's Kushner. Reading 25 isn't on the other hand. This is Telushkin. Rabbi, so I'm going to read this apparently. It's just long and I want to be able to move along here as we go. I'm missing a page. Hold on. Here we go. All right. Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, who had studied hypnosis, recorded an interview he conducted with a hypnotized woman. Responding to Telushkin's questions, she stated that she had just completed travel on the Oregon Trail. During her account, she spoke with a different cadence than her normal speech and used some unusual idioms. For example, she explained that she was having trouble finding a suitable spouse because the men she met were so refractory. She told Telushkin her name and described herself as a 23-year-old teacher, originally from Ithaca, New York. She explained that she was motivated to go to Oregon because of a pamphlet she had read, which she cited by name. She named the organizer of the Wagon Trail, the man who led it, and the point of origin, Independence, Missouri. She also reported that she had kept a diary of her travels. After the session, Telushkin researched the Oregon Trail, finding resources at the New York Public Library and used bookstores. He was able to corroborate most of the names the subject had mentioned. He acquired a copy of the pamphlet she named and even found corroboration of numerous details that she had mentioned. It was clear that outside of hypnosis, the subject knew nothing about the Oregon Trail and little of American history. Telushkin was amazed by the results. Okay, I'm not here to tell you he's right or wrong. I'm reporting what Telushkin said, and so you have obviously two different rabbis, two brilliant rabbis responding very differently to the same question. Gail's shaking her head. Okay. Can't possibly be true. She must have read it. All right. So why, yes. What's been absorbed subconsciously that emerges in these moments? I think that's what you're trying to suggest, right? That maybe we learned things when we were very young and just don't remember them, but under hypnosis they emerge. Is that what you're saying? Or am I missing it? Okay. Maybe we have. Yes, Leslie. Okay, so allow me to play. Who wrote that? Who wrote Midrash? The rabbis, right. The same rabbis who you've all looked and said, I question, wait a minute, what do you mean the soul ascension for centuries? So either you accept their thinking or you don't accept their thinking, all right? Right. Okay, I can't tell you you're right or wrong. I take Midrash with somewhat of a Aesop's fable approach, in that there's a value and a lesson to be learned from it, but I don't take it literally. It's more, for me, it's more metaphorical. It doesn't make me right. And then again, I'm the furthest thing. I'm a traditionalist in the sense of the Mitnagdim. I'm a rationalist like Maimonides, like Sadia Gaon, etc. I am not a Kabbalist. I absolutely reject mystical thinking. as Maimonides would have done as well. Okay, I reject it all. What's that?
There's so many things God hasn't told us to look at.
Or not. Epigenetics? Do share. We're getting a definition of epigenetics. What is it? Ah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually in one of my sermons over the holidays, I spoke about that, about with rats, they found learned behaviors transferred genetically. Yeah, yeah, yep, okay. Yeah, it's possible. Anything is possible. So why did, yeah, Eric? I don't know. The question was the woman hypnotized, was she Jewish? I don't know. Why? Jewish soul. You're implying something I'm not sure I'm getting. Uh-huh. Yeah, who knows if the woman in the 19th century was Jewish or not? We don't know. They were Jews who did make their way out west. You're right, the odds are not great. So let me play with you. You're introducing where I'm going. So well done. You get a lollipop. The problem and the reason these kinds of ideas come up is that we realize that in our world, justice doesn't seem to work. Good people suffer, bad people prosper. How do you make sense out of all this? Particularly, it was a particularly difficult time during the Maccabees. That's why these entered during that time. Suddenly, they're seeing Torah scholars being killed. And so, if justice can't be met on this earth, there must be another level. That's where the ideas of reincarnation, that's where the ideas of resurrection, that's where the ideas of a soul that exists beyond life emerge. Because the world doesn't work otherwise. And so, the pain that a righteous person suffers is not necessarily the result of a personal sin. If I suffer, it's not because of something I did now. It could be a sin I committed in a previous incarnation. It enables me to make sense of my suffering in a world that doesn't seem to make sense. Now, they also, by the way, the rabbis also played with this whole reincarnation to explain odd or unusual occurrences in human characteristics. You're going to love this. You know, there are kids who act like animals. What do you think they were in previous lives? Animals, of course. They inherited the soul of a beast. That's why they act like animals. Why are some females barren? Because they were men in previous lives. All right, converts to Judaism were Jews in previous lives. They've had Jewish souls. I look at this and I go, ha, 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 ha. Okay, I'm not buying they were really animals. I'm not buying that barren women were men. I'm not buying it. Okay? But that's how they explained the world. Again, I said to you earlier, they understood that cause and effect works. They didn't necessarily have the right causes and the right effects. Okay? So as I said earlier, reincarnation is not a substitute for resurrection. It's a stage of the soul before resurrection. Ultimately, resurrection is going to occur as well. All right. I'm already over time. I want to do one last thing, and that is Kaddish. I'm going to deal with Kaddish a little bit. The one custom I haven't mentioned here is Kaddish, because it didn't exist in rabbinic times at all. In the discussion of the Geonim, which is really the 9th and 10th century, we find the mention for the first time of a ritual, funeral ritual known as the Kaddish. This is already, as I said, the 9th and 10th century. The Talmud is finished by the 5th, 6th century. So hundreds of years later, we learn from this text that upon returning from the grave, Kaddish would be recited. If you look at the Kaddish that was said, and the one that's said at a funeral, what it is an affirmation of resurrection, an affirmation of messianic times. When you've lost someone, what would they do? They'd affirm that they will come back. That's what the funeral Kaddish says. That form is unique to Kaddish in general, but its association with burial is clear, but it's also unprecedented in any sense of the Talmud. Sajah Gaon admits that Kaddish is not for the dead. In fact, according to the testimony, Kaddish is not to be recited until the mourner distances himself from the grave at least 6 cubits. So Kaddish being said at the cemetery, according to Sajah Gaon, is inappropriate. Step away first, okay? You're doing that same, it's the same rituals. You don't do rituals in the presence of the deceased. Kaddish seems to be a ritual enacted after speaking of words of Torah. What would happen? You studied Torah, and then you praised God. It's in Aramaic, so it was the language of the people. It's like it was in English, okay? And they would respond to study with words of prayer, of praise. Yit gadal v'yit gadash, great and holy is your name. That's the message of Kaddish. And then they did Kaddish de Rabbanan, the rabbi's Kaddish. This lasted for about 1,000 years. What would happen after that, during the mourning period of a great rabbi or scholar, it was only for great rabbis and scholars, in the mourning period for that, students would gather to study in his honor, and the son of the deceased was given the honor of leading the prayer of declaring God's greatness in response to study. Over time, the study got lost. And what we started to do is just Kaddish. And then over time, it got expanded to beyond just the scholars and the rabbis to everyone. But in its original form, what one did, and I know I went to a Shiva Minyan that Rabbi Gelman did. And what he did is he had study. He studied, and then people said Kaddish. Because that's the original form. It had nothing to do with death. The study was in honor of the dead. And since you studied, you said the follow-up prayer to study. That over time, another change that happened. Okay? Nonetheless, over time, what's happened, we've come to believe, and this is how you superimpose meaning upon practices, once they already exist, that Kaddish would shorten the amount of time that someone would need to get to Gan Eden. That's a much later addition, okay? Sons were called the Kaddishals, all right? And if you don't have somebody to say Kaddish for you, you hired someone. But if you realize from its original intent, that's utterly ridiculous. But that is the folk way of Judaism. What we've done is taken something and made it a folk way. It's not necessarily mitzvah. It's not necessarily even custom of ancient times. It's a new folk way in which the way we understand things. Now I'll take questions. Yes, Gail. I have to imagine in a highly male society, probably not. I won't swear to you, but it doesn't make sense to me. Can I tell you no woman ever said Kaddish? I can't tell you that. Yes.
Just an aside, Hadassah always advertises in Hadassah magazine that you can pay someone to say Kaddish in Israel.
Right, so Hadassah is suggesting that if you can't say Kaddish, pay somebody in Israel to say it for you. What do you think of that?
That always impressed me so this one.
Right. So you as a woman can't say Kaddish for your loved one, you're going to pay somebody else. I find that offensive.
Our dear friend in Israel, Julia,
Mm-hmm.
in Iraq,
Mm-hmm.
she was in Israel in that hotel. She had to say Kaddish for the day. And
Right. There's so many levels on which, from an Orthodox perspective, that's just all bizarre. What do you mean she became a rabbi? Right. So the fact that she's saying Kaddish is like a secondary issue. The first issue is, what do you mean she's a rabbi? How can she be a rabbi? Yes. Well, it's not an obligation for sure, but in the way Judaism understands ritual, as a general rule, those who are not obligated to do things probably should not. That's the traditional lens on it, okay? I would say as a conservative Jew, I'm not buying that. But in the traditional lens, that's generally the case. People who are not obligated, cannot. And that's the example of, for example, who can be, it was much more difficult to declare women can be cantors than rabbis. Why? Because a rabbi doesn't represent the congregation in prayer. He's not saying the words. The cantor is. The rule is that in order to lead the community in prayer, you have to be someone who is equally obligated, or other people cannot fulfill their responsibility through you. So to say amen to my blessing would no longer fulfill your obligation if I'm a woman, okay? Play all you want. Obviously, I'm not buying Sandy and then Eric, yeah. Right. Right. And that's been a minhag, and the same thing walking out for Yisker. The same concept is that, people whose parents are alive, you don't stay for Yisker. It's like I'm wishing them dead. Yeah. Right. Most rabbis outside the Orthodox world started to do that, indeed. Look, my mom was a traditionalist in her own way. She had to deal with the fact that I, as the cantor, am saying Yisker. Right. Eric. Reading 15. Mm-hmm. The great majority of people, the question is, those online, if you stand before God in judgment, what happens if you don't make it? So the great majority of people, oh, okay. The great majority of people are, look, most of us are on some place on a continuum. While there probably are some people who are ultimately evil, and a few people who are ultimately good, it's probably few in number that don't fit somewhere in a continuum. So the great majority are going to make it. Now, if you are one of those people who doesn't, you go to Gehinnom. We don't know what that means any more than, we know what hell really means. Most of us take hell and we put Dante's Inferno upon it. All right, but that's one interpretation. We don't have an answer of what that's really like. We know you don't want to go there. Yeah, but most people will find their way. It's just a matter of how much time of repentance. So have I upset everybody? I love this reading. This book was great. It really threw me. I had to write a paper on this, and yeah, you just got the results of the paper. Thank you.